As so many different combat occurrences had already been occurring within the first several hours of the overall invasion as a whole, and really even within the first 2.5 hours of the battle at Oklahoma City, which actually started in so far as the contact phase of it, 30 minutes after the official kickoff of the invasion with the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes and the booting on of the electronic warfare systems, the different combat occurrences had different variations in the amount of time that they lasted based upon specific objectives. And these objectives were predicated upon the aftermath, such as utilizing certain key infrastructure and areas in the future occupation that was to come. Now, as the 58th Independent Special Operations Battalion, it was decided that a more wise use of their resources, instead of letting them just simply wait to be picked up by the Transportation Helicopter Battalion of the 58th Aviation Regiment, which was beginning to do a phased withdrawal of them from the battle with American militia-type forces at their muster point in the northwest end of town, instead of them just simply waiting on their CCP property to be shuttled into the downtown to begin different operations, as there was a multifaceted special operations operation planned in the downtown area. They had been utilized in the assistance in the suppression and destruction of these American armed civilian militia forces, as these forces inadvertently posed a direct threat to the electronic warfare battalion from the 58th SIGINT/EW regiment due to the sensitive nature of the equipment and the vital nature of the equipment, as this equipment helped to jam all of the redundant American communications in the form of radio, and also, where applicable, even portable radio or radar systems, as well as it applied to systems such as Patriot air defense systems and other similar types of systems. These forces had to be crushed and rapidly. And as the fighting in this area had wrapped up at about 2:30, the phased withdrawal began even before this, with withdrawing forces gradually, a company at a time, of these special operations companies comprising the whole 58th Special Operations Independent Battalion, with the final elements being withdrawn just after 2:30 and being flown into the downtown area, with most of the first companies being brought in, landing in the southwestern portion of downtown, where they were to fan out and start a cordon around the western end of downtown facing east, with some of these forces securing vital bridges across the Oklahoma River for the quickly advancing battalion from the Mechanized Infantry Battalion from the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade to move into the area and split up with the remaining forces of the 2nd of the 134th American Airborne Infantry Battalion, the 2nd Battalion of the 134th Infantry Regiment, to be engaged and destroyed by half of the Chinese PLA Mechanized Infantry Battalion from the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade, while the other half would cross these secured bridges to engage the Americans and comprise the southern end of the western pocket of downtown, while the eastern pocket would be comprised by the rapidly advancing elements that have already begun to establish themselves in downtown from the 118th Combined Arms Brigade and 190th Combined Arms Brigade of the PLA's 58th Group Army, consisting of a Mechanized Infantry Battalion and Combat Engineer Battalion from the 190th, the Combat Engineers having captured a Army National Guard armory before advancing and comprising the northern or northwestern portion of this cordon, with the Mechanized Infantry Battalion advancing along I-35, securing it until it reached its portion of the cordon, with a Armored Battalion, Mechanized Infantry Battalion, and Combat Engineer Battalion clearing I-35 on the way down during flank clearance operations before reaching its portions of the cordon, linking up with the Armored Battalion from the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade, moving to the northwest from having previously secured the Tinker Air Force Base. As two companies from the 58th Special Operations Battalion were tasked with the high-value target capture mission, as these high-value individuals were wanted alive, which included the state regime political leadership, as a separate but linked mission conducted by companies from the same battalion would occur with the local regime leadership at the City Hall. The state regime leadership across I-235, which was a spur of I-35 that went around with I-35 to ring the downtown area and its eastern ends, would be captured by two companies from the 58th Independent Special Operations Battalion, who would also play a role in surgically removing the final remaining full firing battery of the 1st of the 160th Artillery Battalion of the 45th Infantry Brigade Combat Team. The reason why this battery of artillery, this last firing battery of the battalion, hadn't been completely destroyed in the artillery saturation operation, smashing many vehicles of the other firing batteries and vehicles of its headquarters battery, was because this force was located in the actual cap complex, and it was determined that due to the nature of these areas that were to become the red zone, similar to the American green zone, during the occupation phase for colonial or colonization operations conducted by the Chinese in Oklahoma City, in this local area, as there would be many red zones in many major American cities. All attempts were made, as much as humanly possible, to not totally outright completely destroy the entire city, although this was exceedingly difficult, and many areas of the city were indeed left in complete and utter and total ruination. The International Airport battle, occurring concurrently, as many of these different battles that were going on within the first several hours all lasted different durations of time, and this typically corresponded to their level of usefulness after this battle was completely over with the International Airport and other key infrastructure being seen as important for the colonization operations to follow in the occupation, such as the Will Rogers International Airport being utilized as a megafob, or the downtown area being utilized as the red zone for colonists to be brought in to economically exploit the land. These operations during this battle were taking longer than, say, operations such as the Kill Box that occurred, where the whole 1st of the 279th was completely and totally decimated in a matter of 30 minutes, as this particular area where they were destroyed was seen as much less vital than were the infrastructure that was being captured as much intact as was possible, which included power plants. And even though the water treatment plant was captured relatively intact, the areas around it were utterly saturated with munitions during this particular battle with the 1st of the 279th. In the downtown area, the Special Operations battalions, most of which had already been landed by this point, by 3 a.m., the final two were landing in the southwest of the downtown area and also in the middle by I-235 to conduct their high-value target operation. There were two full companies. One company had already been landed in this area and established a secure landing zone, wherein the first platoons of the second and last company to arrive in this particular area between these two pockets that were developing would be flown in to this secure landing zone, while the last platoon of the second company being flown in would be landing in more hotly contested zones, as they would have tactically important areas that they would be tasked with capturing outright in air assault operations. Also supporting them would be elements from the Heavy Special Weapons Support Company, also a company within the 58th Special Operations Battalion, in addition to the headquarters company and the 6 regular operator companies. The Heavy Special Weapons Company would contribute 2 squads from its robotics platoon, which also one squad was actually a sniper and spotter squad, in addition to the robotics squads, of which there were 4 robotic squads, and then there was the sniper and spotter squad. The entire sniper and spotter squad being sent in to support these 2 companies in this operation, in addition to an FPV squad from the FPV drone platoon of that company, and a robotics operating squad with their robots in this particular area. They, having already been flown in with the first company before the second full company of operators had been flown into the area. This all occurring between 3 and 3:30 a.m., with the last elements landing around 3:30. Just as the battle for the Will Rogers International Airport was within full swing. And although the tenant unit that actually had a base at the Will Rogers International Airport, a National Guard unit, an Air National Guard unit, the 137th Wing, wasn't present as it was deployed to the Middle East at the time and thus wasn't mentioned, the other forces that were there were being engaged at the time by the Air Defense Artillery Battalion of the 17th Combined Arms Brigade, with its troops being utilized in a ground assault role as there were no viable air targets as they assaulted airport buildings with their devastating quad 25mm autocannons on their SP-AAA-95 vehicles. Although they couldn't use their FN-6s as these were strictly air defense missiles, they did use their quad 25mm autocannons to devastating effects on these vehicles. And the Military Police Company, which was a part of the larger headquarters battalion, with both of these forces surrounding and clearing the entire Will Rogers International Airport by 4:30 a.m. As this operation was already well underway well before then, with the forces gradually being flown in from before 2:30, with one company being brought in, and then later after 3 with the final elements of the second company being brought in, along with the elements from the Heavy Special Weapons Company also being brought in. These forces were preparing to do their surgical strike to capture key state regime elements in the CAP complex, which was actually on the eastern side of 235, just to the side of it, and also the Oklahoma State National Guard Military Command elements, which were also within the CAP complex itself. As these helos brought these forces into the area, the Z-20 helos of the 58th Aviation Regiment's Transportation Helicopter Battalion, these forces on this map, within this 1 by 1 mile area, began to move in for their operation. There was 2 platoons from the lead company, as there was still one full entire company of operators just off the map and to the south, holding a secure landing zone area along I-235, just directly south of this 1 by 1 mile area where the CAP complex was, which was laid out in an interesting manner and actually had a road, a street that ran under the whole complex, with elevated streets going up on either side and street-level streets that ran underneath the elevated streets. And again, there was a tunnel that had a street running under this area, such as the tunnel right here, the street going up beneath it. This was a interesting layout for a capital complex indeed. And these elevated streets made the terrain interesting terrain for sure, as this area was to be secured as much intact as was humanly possible. And although there already had been some surgical artillery strikes, all ISR directed, of course, as the precision strikes had already leveled some of the buildings in the northwestern end of the Cap complex on the other side of the elevated road, leaving many of these buildings intact. They were also done in such a way to ensure that the road infrastructure, which was seen as absolutely vital to logistics and transport, especially during the occupation that was to come, leaving it intact. And as the two platoons of 5 squads each of regular operators, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, with the robotics section from the Special Heavy Weapons Company moving into this gutted building right here that was damaged from a shell that splashed just off the map into the south. These robotics operators were controlling these 10 armed, quad-legged robots that were equipped with W-85 heavy 12.7 millimeter machine guns. They were part of a whole different company, but they had been flown in with these 2 regular operator companies to support their operation, their surgical strike mission to not only capture the high-value military and local state political targets here, but also to eliminate surgically the last remaining firing battery of the first of the 160th, as many of their other batteries to the west had since been destroyed, at least their vehicles had been, with some of the troops surviving, but for the most part, the rest of the whole battalion had since been basically annihilated and ceased to exist as a functional unit in terms of what it originally had been. There were, of course, paramilitary elements, as again, this was the state cap complex, and naturally there were security forces that were basically posted to this particular area, in addition to the military elements of the firing battery that was tasked with guarding the complex here. Now, outside of the complex, of course, there are various office buildings and commercial buildings, many of which in the northwest of the complex having been shelled and annihilated between the complex and the interstate area, although some were still relatively well intact, like this being the highest building in this particular map, this 1 mile by 1 mile map, at 8 floors. And as this platoon here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squads, the 5 over here in the robotics operator squad, moved into the area, the sniper and spotter squad, which was comprised of 5 sniper spotter teams, had been moving into the tallest building in the area, as it gave them the best conceivable view over the entire area from a 360-degree panoramic view from the 8th floor of this building. They didn't go onto the roof, but the forces that had landed on the roof had since gone down to the 1st floor before crossing the street and entering this building, with the forces of these 2 squads, as they moved into this area, engaging and eliminating these 4 armed American civilians before they went into this building, leaving 1 squad in the building to watch this road, as this squad moved up to watch the tunnel that led into the complex. And they had 1 squad go in this building with the squad from the roof that came down. Now, this squad and this squad had both moved into this building to clear it before 1 squad went in this building, leaving 1 here to watch the road. Now, there was a platoon from this same company that this platoon and this platoon was part of, and they were now landing. They were the last forces to land. There were 5 squads of them in a platoon, and these Z-20 utility helicopters of the Transportation Helicopter Battalion were the last to land, 2 on the highway, with 1 squad rappelling down the side of this very high elevated highway that was on support pillars. There's a railroad track right here. And this squad, after they After the diamond formation they formed around their helo to provide security for their helo, when their helo left, they began to rappel down the side of this highway and went in to clear this building before going in and taking their final position in this building to watch this side of the road as the sniper and spotter squad ran into this building to get to the 8th floor, which was already clear by this point, and now had an additional squad. This squad, as it cleared this building and went into this building and now went into this building to guard the ground floor as the snipers and spotters climbed the stairs to the 8th floor. They now had a full panoramic view of the entire area with their sniper rifles. Now, while that happened, this squad, in its diamond formation, upon its helo leaving the area after dropping them off, had moved into the area above this street down here. Now they set up right here to watch the tunnel entrance right here at the end of this street. But they would also be inadvertently engaging these forces that would be peeling around this area, as would these two squads that went into this building here. As this squad would guard the area from up on top of this highway here, they would have an excellent view themselves over this whole wider area, along with these snipers in this relatively tall building just to their slight southeast across the street, while they were above the street and could see straight ahead and over here, and even slightly over this way. Now, this helo dropped off its squad in this parking lot. This squad had been dropped off, and its helo since left the area by this point. So, basically, they went into this rubble pile and set up a position right here in the rubble. As they were crossing the street, they were starting to be engaged by some of these armed civilians coming around. And there are multiple things happening at the same time on this map, so showing them in order, as always, is a bit difficult, but it will be attempted in the most coherent way possible. Now, this squad, having gone into this building's upper floors, this was about a 3-floor building, had begun to fire out the windows at these armed American civilians, and they had taken fire back from them, but eventually eliminated them with small arms fire from firing out these windows, before they themselves left this building and bounded over to this rubble pile and started a fire into this group over here. Now, this squad in a diamond formation, as they pulled security around their helo as they all disembarked from it, coming out of either side of it, the helo left, and then they formed into a wedge formation and went over here across the street next to the squad that took position in this rubble pile that used to be a building. These were taller buildings that earlier, as they'd been struck by 152 artillery shells, had completely collapsed into the road and were blocking the street right here completely. And this one having spilled a little bit into the street here, with a little bit of this one spilling in. By this point, the troops taking position in this rubble had since fired at these personnel, causing many of them to end up fleeing across the street this way, while civilians, armed American civilians that were already here, were fleeing around this corner, this way, and this way, going in different directions. As again, there was no cohesiveness, no coordination. There were no communications, of course, and there was no way really to coordinate any type of defenses other than spreading word of mouth. And these were basically just ad hoc armed civilians that didn't really have any plan or any way to coordinate their activities. They were just fighting back on a whim. They were reactionary. They didn't really know what to do other than to point and shoot at the enemy, and that's what they were trying to do, to the best of their ability, of course. But their enemy, the Chinese, had total ISR dominance. These troops, a lot of them had good combat experience from the Syrian civil conflict, as some of these troops rotated through other units like the Night Tigers that served in the Syrian civil war. And as they were now part of the 58th Independent Special Operations Battalion, they were using those skills to great effect against not just the American military, but of course their armed reactionary civilians that were completely and totally being slaughtered at this point, as snipers fired out of the top floors at a whole target-rich environment that lay before them, not just in the immediate area, but on the other side, inside of the cap complex that was ringed by this high elevation road that went up this way, as this street and this street that ran past these buildings that lay between it went straight on the street level to this intersection with this street that went behind the cap building itself, and also went up and around the cap building where it went back to lower elevation on another two streets that were laid out similar to this on the northern end. So essentially, these streets drove around the cap buildings and offices on the western side and the eastern side of these offices and the cap building itself. Now, intelligence, again, prior to the invasion, had pinpointed that the state regime leadership, as well as the state's military command over the National Guard, Air and Army National Guard, were all located in the cap at the time of the invasion. And being that this was only literally several hours into it, they were still there. And they had not been able to leave the area. And they were under the protection of the armed forces in the form of this field artillery firing battery that had been assigned to guard the area, and also the standard cap security forces. Now, this platoon, in clearing the flanks, had engaged these armed civilians on this side of this tunnel that this road ran over, and they had engaged and defeated them early on in the flank clearance of this particular area before clearing this building that had 8 armed civilians in it. This was about a 4-floor building right here, before they then emerged and climbed up the slight elevation onto the street right here before taking position here. Now, they were being fired at the whole time, so there's green here where this begins, and the green goes around the troops where the map opens up at, and they return fire. And then as they go in these buildings, there's green around the arrow because they're being fired at as they breach the building and make entry. And they clear it and go through it and fight inside of it. And then they leave the building and get up on here from where they're taking fire at from enemy personnel on the tops of the cap building, as there's 3 groups of 2 here. There's a group of 2 up here, a group of 2 here. These little boxes on these buildings are the roof access points, like either the stairs or ladders to get to the roof access, including on this building here where these forces in this diamond formation, this one squad, went downstairs to go over to this building, while this squad clearing this building went over here and here, while the other squad going in to clear it alongside of it stayed to watch the tunnel entrance here, along with this squad of the platoon moving up to the tunnel right there. Now, there was firing going on from around the corner of the tunnel by this squad to support their troops moving up here to the intersection, and the troops moving up here on high, on this higher elevated road here, to fire at enemies on the roofs, firing down at them and at these other armed robots that are being followed by this rolling T formation of troops that stopped right here. Now, as all of this was going on, as this rolling T formation of special operators followed these 3 armed robots to this corner, and they were laying down fire in conjunction with the fire coming from their forces right here before they advanced through the tunnel after clearing all of these armed personnel, these security forces here, and here. And they engaged them right off the bat, these armed robots right off the bat, before these armed robots smoked all of them, before they moved into place and were still being fired at from these roofs and from inside the building itself. And even from these troops, this half squad of troops, about 5 of them, maneuvering around here to engage them. They had been returning fire, and even as this robot moved up to try to outflank them while these others fired, they were still taking fire, but they had eventually just cut them all down. Even the fire that was coming from up here eventually lessened as the snipers got into position and began to simply smoke these guys on the roof of the Cap building. I mean, they could see them from the 8th floor. They were relatively well high up. These troops that of this squad here that had taken position up here were laying down heavy fire on the Americans coming around the corner here. So were the 2 squads inside this building and the squad in this building on the 1st floor firing at the corner, while the sniper and spotters were up here firing down here and at enemies over here on these roofs in support of the troops moving in on the ground. It was very surgical, and the squad here moved into position here to lay down fire support from up here as well. And before then, moving over here, as they were in a wedge formation, and their wedge was already firing it back and forth with personnel that were up here engaging them. There was a back and forth exchange between these armed civilians and them on this elevated road as they were higher up than the ground level at the street level down below. And as these forces advanced into the area, these forces now began to split up, with these 3 armed robots going over here, while the squad that followed behind them, the rolling T formation, now hugged up against the wall and began to fire around it at enemy personnel, as these Americans fired back at the bots as they turned to peel around the corner to check the corner before the squad did. But they were exchanging fire back and forth before the squad tried to get up to the wall. They were cut down in the process by the bot and by the squad peeling around. Now, there was still some fire coming through the windows from this building here, from the forces that were inside it, as again, there was a whole company of troops here. Some of them were inside of these buildings, and most of them were outside and in the vehicles. There was a platoon of troops with these 3 squads and these 2 half squads here. And there was another platoon of troops in these buildings and vehicles put together. And then you had troops in these vehicles, and you had a few more over here. Now, the rest of the forces in here were the military leadership over the whole Oklahoma Guard, and were not part of the actual firing battery, but were different. They were the high-value targets, as well as the security forces of the building itself, and some of the security forces of the whole complex were in these buildings as well. And they were returning fire. These were like SWAT-level paramilitary forces that had some military-grade small arms and such, but they were trying to put up as good of a fight as they can, but they were taking a lot of fire from these bots and from the troops themselves as they prepared to move. After hugging the wall, they prepared to bound and storm this building, while this bot moved up and continued to lay down exchange fire with these forces over here, as this squad, after having handled their business over here, moved with this squad that had stopped in the road here beside this squad that was holding this rubble pile. They bounded on this rubble pile here that had spilled out in the road from what had been a formerly large building after precision artillery strikes had struck this area earlier, while they were still over here and here, as their quadcopter reconnaissance drones had beamed in the precise coordinates for 152 millimeter strikes to finish off the rest of these forces. As again, these buildings had already been hit once and had been completely leveled. So hitting these in particular again was no big deal, and it was a safe enough distance from the highway that it didn't matter. And it was still across this elevated street from the Cap complex, so these could be hit. Now, these buildings weren't seen as anywhere near as important at the very end here, so there were a few precision strikes called in to eliminate these vehicles over this way, and they were completely destroyed, including this Fast V and this FDC vehicle right here and some of the troops outside, and it gutted these buildings on the corners where the shells struck closest to over here. But these buildings were still mostly intact and would eventually be raided by these ground troops moving into the area. Now, basically, what happened after these two squads, this original squad, and then the squad that was up here that went down here, got in here, and then bounded over here. These two squads moved through this area. One took this corner, while the other bounded across the street and took this corner, and prepared to move through this tunnel that ran beneath this elevated street. All the while, this FPV drone section with its two quad-legged non-armed robots that carried all their FPV drones, as they carried quite a few, that had moved into this gutted building where the floors were literally exposed on the east-facing side of the building. They could just launch these drones and fly them right off of these upper floors of this building, and they began to fly over this area, along with some CH-901A loitering munitions that were armed with heat warheads that had earlier been fired into this part of the city in support of other units of the 190th Combined Arms Brigade, namely its Combat Engineer Battalion and Mechanized Infantry Battalion, now in the northern part of the downtown area, holding a cordon there. The drones fired into this area that were equipped with heat warheads. 4 of them had made it to this cap complex area and were loitering, as the name implies, as they were loitering munitions, these CH-901As, and they began to destroy some of the guns that were located in this area. This firing battery lost 2 to CH-901As. It lost 1 to a loitering, or to an FPV drone coming in right here. And it lost a Fast V to an FPV drone. This firing platoon lost a gun, an M109A6 Paladin to a CH-901A. And it lost a Fast V to one. And it lost its other gun to an FPV drone. And an FPV drone struck the fuel truck that was part of the headquarters platoon of this firing battery. And this FPV drone hit this gun. This one was coming over to hit the last gun. And the Fast V and FDC vehicle would be destroyed by 152 shell fire hitting this area and would horribly damage and essentially cripple this one too, which would be destroyed when the special operators moving into this particular area would reach that area, as they were making quick progress. The armed robots, 2 of which moving down slightly less steep elevation back to the ground level, with the 2 operator squads dropping down, moving one behind another before splitting up into 2, carefully and quickly did short bounds and covers as they were taking fire from this building at this point. Although the enemies on the roof had been eliminated by them early on, with sniper fire coming at them, and even fire coming from the troops manning this bridge, firing all the way over here as well, having had eliminated a lot of these forces, they still did short bounds and covers because they were taking fire from some of the windows, and they kept returning fire as they moved. And same from their robots levying fire down on this building too, with them then moving up and securing the flanks, including this one right here. Now, as the Americans were not stagnant this whole time, these 2 squads, as this one had earlier been covered, moving up, handled by the bots and the squad peeling around the corner. This one moving up, this wedge formation, besides this wedge formation, as mentioned earlier, had moved along the side of the cap building here before coming around the corner and fighting these forces before these bots had completely mowed them down completely, before this bot moved up and was no longer taking fire. And this one had moved here by the time this one was right here taking fire both from the wedge. But after they eliminated this squad, these 2, they stopped taking fire, and so did these guys by the time they reached and began to clear this building. As they ran through the corridors and rooms, kicking in the doors of every room of this building, they began to clear this building. And while that was happening, these squads had peeled around this tunnel and went through this tunnel, bounding and covering tactically, with this squad peeling around this corner to clear this building, with this squad entering through the front this way, with the 2 bots out of the 3 that were here entering this way, while this one stood guard after having had gotten in an earlier firefight with this squad, this half squad here, and this half squad here, and this MRAP that had been since destroyed by an FPV drone as it came over and blasted the MRAP. And this squad peeled the corner and helped this bot grease these squads. They coordinated their fire against it. And this squad peeled around to clear this building, while this squad helped clear this building with this squad here. After this squad, the Rolling T squad here, and this squad that had come in from under the tunnel after having guarded the tunnel entrance here, kicking in doors on this side, clearing the part of the building on this end, while this squad cleared this, and another squad cleared this. They were taking this building and had captured all of their HVTs after having thoroughly cleared it of both paramilitary security elements and a few of the military troops that were actually inside of this building that were left. Now, as that was going on, these two squads that had bounded and covered up to this building that were clearing it had made their way around and engaged and defeated this squad that had half squad that had fired back at the building, as you can see by the green, as this building took some fire from these personnel early on. And as this squad had peeled around, they had engaged them, but they had gotten in a firefight from back here, and they eliminated this squad. As again, showing this in order is difficult, but it's coming along well, as these two squads then came out after getting in their firefight and charged at this building and kicked open entryways, including windows, into this building and began clearing it. Now, there was only a full squad of armed combatants in this building, of armed troops. These were troops. And these two half squads had been defeated by this point while this building was now being cleared. This is after the shells had impacted and destroyed these vehicles. And these armed civilians that had been running up on this elevated street over these streets on the street level that went under these tunnels, these bridges that the street comprised, they were now defeated by this point. They were all cut down by sniper fire, also by fire coming from small arms from the squad holding this elevated highway bridge, and the snipers firing from this building, and these loitering munitions, and all of these different FPV drones coming into the area simply annihilated the vehicles of the two firing platoons of the battery, including some of their headquarters platoon vehicles like the fuel truck here, the M88 armored recovery vehicle, some of the LMTVs that were badly shredded up in the crossfire from the bot, and the squads peeling through this area, including the one clearing this building now. And these squads then, after clearing this building, went around to clear the remains of this building, as these two buildings have been gutted by the proximity of the shell hits that destroyed these vehicles. The ends of these buildings facing on the north side were completely gutted, and the floors could be seen as the walls had collapsed. And they, upon clearing this building, entering now through the gutted parts of the building, met up with their other squad clearing this building. And by this point, they had essentially thoroughly and methodically and surgically and precisely captured the high-value individuals, both political and military, that they had sought to capture, while mostly even preserving these structures for further use during the occupation, as this was to become the colonial leaders' residence and offices for when the red zone was established over this particular city. Now, as this particular cordon was already being established to the north and east by maneuver units, the special operator companies, both companies that had conducted the operation, the company actually doing the operation, and the full company guarding a landing zone area off the map into the slight south and west, These forces would hold their positions, although they would call in a helo to the 8th-floor building from where they would shuffle their prisoners down the street under the bridge here and to the building to basically fly them back to a CCP property where they would be interrogated and basically kept as prisoners of war, while leaving the special operators to hold their new acquisitions and defend this area from any counterattacks coming from the trapped Americans that are now stuck within the eastern cordon of downtown, as two cordons were now appearing, as shown on the larger map, a western cordon of downtown and an eastern cordon of downtown. Now, this mission was surgically precise and highly successful. There were only a few wounded in actions and a few damaged quad-legged robots during this entire exchange. The combination of ISR dominance and the Americans' lack of any ISR assets and also no communications and hence no coordination, total shock and awe and surprise on the part of the invasion forces and the experience of the operators too, as well as the superiority in weapons, tactics, and doctrines, and also even the door gunners contributing from the helos as they came into a hot area early on and fired down into the enemy forces they could see, with loitering munitions and FPV drones and robotics contributing to the success level of the operation as a whole, simply made the operation a highly prized success in the eyes of the 58th PLA Group Army. Now these forces provided a wedge between what had been one pocket of enemy forces in the downtown area, now divided it into two complete pockets, while also eliminating the last firing battery surgically precisely and capturing the most important high-value individuals in the entire state. This level of success also was intricately linked to another high degree of success, which had to do with the other special operations companies and assets operating elsewhere in the downtown area. Other companies had captured and secured vital bridges between the entertainment district and the downtown, the western end of downtown, while forming a southern cordon and an east-facing cordon or western cordon, and now began to help cordon from the north as well, while artillery continued to fly in and hit enemies anywhere they appeared, while having mostly eliminated all the vehicles of the 1st of the 160th by this point in the battle, coming from the artillery battalion of the 190th Combined Arms Brigade, which had ample targets between firing upon American armed civilian combatant militia forces, firing against the forces downtown of the 1st of the 160th, and firing on other elements of the same battalion of the reserves that was holding the Will Rogers International Airport, its other two companies, besides its headquarters and Alpha Company in the airport, its other two companies, Bravo and Charlie, trying to hold an area north of a guard armory that was struck by cruise missiles by 2 o'clock, with the sewage and water treatment plant having had been shelled meticulously since early on in the invasion by this same battalion. Now that the 1st of the 160th seemed to, for the most part, not even exist anymore, except for scattered individual ground troops here and there, without vehicles, without weapons, including their howitzers and other heavy weapons they'd once had, these forces would now begin to gradually be eliminated in the westernmost pocket by the special operators, and half of the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade's incoming mechanized infantry battalion, which was about to split in half, leaving half of it half of its companies to engage the remainder of the 2nd of the 134th, having itself been badly smashed into oblivion by field artillery howitzers from the 17th Combined Arms Brigade's Artillery Battalion, and also 300 millimeter rocket strikes from A300 systems coming from the 77th Group Army 77th Artillery Brigade's A300 Battalion, which had horribly saturated the entertainment district, leveling entire neighborhoods, massive neighborhoods of it, destroying many commercial structures along with it, leaving very few survivors of the 2nd Battalion of the 134th, except for those who had the foresight to flee to underground areas such as sewers, deep basements in many of these larger buildings, and maintenance tunnels that were underground, leaving them to emerge to now fight the oncoming Chi-Com mechanized infantry forces that were seeking to basically cordon and sweep them off the map, literally and figuratively speaking, while the rest of this battalion that was going to do this would move across the bridges, having earlier been seized by the air assault operations during the phased withdrawal from the earlier fighting that occurred with the militia-type forces of the Americans, also conducted by the 58th, as they were phased withdrawn from there to carry out their operations in the downtown area. Over here in the western part of the city, at a major highway junction, a large pocket had formed that was now being gradually reduced on all sides by 2 mechanized infantry battalions squeezing in on what had been over 500 total American armed civilian personnel combatants, which had been prosecuting a quasi-successful guerrilla operation there, having actually destroyed several vehicles with Molotovs only because they were able to stay still long enough and be able to ambush them from relatively well-hidden positions, although they were being squeezed into a tighter and tighter pocket and would soon be decimated as the fighting there was drawing to a close. Although this fighting had been raging since the beginning of the overall operation, as heavy artillery was coming in and striking ISR-directed targets anywhere they were spotted. In the next video, the battle between the Mechanized Infantry Battalion of the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade clearing the center of the metro area, about to engage the 2nd of the 134th, which had essentially, for all intents and purposes, already began, will be explored along with the other special operations missions and mechanized infantry battalion missions with the other half of the battalion to be followed up after that, along with the battle against the 545th Brigade Engineering Battalion, and later the 1st Squadron of the 180th Cav Regiment of the 45th Infantry Brigade Combat Team. Bit by bit, the entire American forces present in the Battle of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, were being gradually ripped to pieces. Some much faster than were others. And again, the only reason all of them hadn't been was because some were in certain positions that the Chinese were trying to spare as much as possible from complete destruction, as they wanted to use certain areas for their own during the occupation phase of the oncoming war of occupation that was about to come after the invasion phase and conquest of America had concluded, with the invasion phase only lasting for mere days. Although the occupation would become a war of counterinsurgency, the Chinese planned to use these areas in their colonial operations as they planned to colonize and exploit the land and its resources and people, such as the Red Zone that was to become the downtown area, and the Will Rogers International Airport, soon to be Megafob, Although other areas, such as the kill box area with the 1st of the 279th, had been extremely fast, a 30-minute battle, much like the fighting that was actually less than that against the ad hoc civilian refugee camp, and many other instances of combat that were much shorter, while others were longer, such as the Will Rogers International Airport battle, that in totality, again, from its actual beginning at the capture of the federal prison complex to the end where the main airport was captured, was roughly 2 hours long, with the operation to capture the high-value targets actually lasting a total hour in duration. The fighting against the remains of the 2nd of the 134th would last a little bit of time, not because it wasn't able to be finished relatively quickly, but it was because of the conditions within which it was being fought in complete abject rubble piles, with underground areas within which these forces were able to hide within. This is next, in the next video of the hypothetical invasion documentary series with the Oklahoma City, Oklahoma battle.